Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Roy Young, and I'm the president and CEO of the Montpelier Foundation. At Montpelier, our talented staff are working hard, educating, inspiring, and engaging the public with their continuing work, which includes blog posts, websites, podcasts, online courses, webinars, and social media platforms for the public to enjoy. We're also very pleased to be partnering with JMU to promote some of our events to alumni, students, and faculty, including a virtual book club on October 8th at 7 p.m. with Elizabeth Dowling Taylor to discuss her book, A Slave in the White House, Paul Jennings and the Madisons. It is my pleasure to serve as your host this evening for tonight's event celebrating free speech on our nation's college campuses. Tonight, JMU and Bridgewater College have joined forces to bring us here together to hear from ACLU attorney Emerson Sykes. Both universities have tremendous public lecture series, and I'm thrilled to be here to help kick off this collaboration. The mission of Bridgewater College's Endowed Lectures program is to bring to campus speakers, ideas, and opinions that will challenge students and community members to become more informed, responsible, and engaged citizens. While the Madison Vision Series is a lecture series honoring James Madison's conviction that cultivating an informed and educated citizenry is essential to the health of our Republican democracy, the series brings scholars, thinkers, and leaders of all kinds to campus for lively exploration of issues facing our society. Both these lecture series share the focus on building an effective citizenry, which is something that those of us at James Madison's Montpelier hold near and dear to our hearts. It is only through the open discussion of ideas that we can begin to explore the challenges and opportunities that our country faces today. Madison famously stated that the advancement and diffusion of knowledge is the only guardian of true liberty. And the existence of the First Amendment is one of the key bulwarks against infringements on our freedoms. Today, we explore the ways that free speech issues are discussed on college campuses and how two universities, one large public and one small private one, negotiate issues of free speech on their campus. ACLU attorney Emerson Sykes will lead tonight's discussion first with an overview of the issue, followed by a question and answer session with President John Alger from James Madison University and President David Bushman from Bridgewater College. Finally, we will invite the audience to submit questions in writing in the Zoom chat that I will pose for consideration. Emerson Sykes is a staff attorney with the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project, where he focuses on First Amendment free speech protections. Prior to joining the ACLU in 2018, he was a legal advisor for Africa at the International Center for Nonprofit Law. He provided technical legal assistance and training to African civil society leaders, government officials, law students, and other stakeholders to improve the legal framework protecting the freedom of association, assembly, and expression. Previously, he served as Assistant General Counsel to the New York City Council, where he worked to increase transparency for council members' discretionary spending and contributed to the council's Friend of the Court brief against the NYPD Stop and Frisk program. Emerson previously conducted research and wrote about U.S. foreign policy for the Century Foundation, a progressive think tank, and worked for the National Democratic Institute's Central and West Africa team. He holds a JD from the New York University School of Law, where he was a Root Tilden Kern Scholar for Public Interest Law, and a Master's of Public Affairs degree from the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. Please join me in a warm welcome for Emerson Sykes. Emerson?
Thanks very much, Roy. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Special thanks to Jennifer Babcock from Bridgewater College, who reached out with this great invitation, and also to Bridgewater College as a university and James Madison University for this really great opportunity to talk about some important campus speech issues at this pivotal moment, as you mentioned. It's a great honor to share this virtual dais with the two esteemed university presidents, as you mentioned, one from a large public university, one from a small private university. I'd be remiss if I didn't note, though, that we have a manel here today. So I do hope that when we go to the Q&A, we can make sure that we prioritize questions from women. But just as a brief roadmap of what I want to cover today, I want to talk a little bit, an introduction to my work at the ACLU and some First Amendment basics for those of the members of the audience who are students or may not be as familiar as my esteemed co-panelists are. A couple of examples of how we've engaged in some of these issues in the real world. The changing context of school online in the midst of a pandemic. And then I want to finish off with a few lessons learned, takeaways, some do's and don'ts of engaging in these types of issues that I've compiled over my few years working at the ACLU. So that's a brief overview of what I want to cover. So as you mentioned, I'm a staff attorney with the ACLU Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. My portfolio is primarily First Amendment and the right to protest, the intersection of free speech and racial justice, and campus speech. So obviously we're here to talk about campus speech, but as you might imagine, those other issues in terms of protest and free speech and racial justice are also very relevant on campus and also very relevant to current events. So we are keeping quite busy, as you might imagine. The ACLU as an organization has been at the forefront of the fight for civil rights and civil liberties for 100 years. And especially, I think we can take a great deal of credit for the modern interpretation of the First Amendment and the uniquely strong protections that we have for free speech in the United States. As Roy mentioned, my background is in international human rights, and our understanding of free speech and our protections for such a wide variety of speech really do set us apart from other countries. So we can talk about that a bit more as we go along. So just a couple of First Amendment basics just to orient us before we get into some of the more practical examples. I think the first thing, as we mentioned, is that it matters whether you're a public university or a private university. The First Amendment constrains government. The First Amendment starts with Congress shall make no law, and abridging the freedom of speech, religion, the press, and assembly. But it's really about Congress, right? In international human rights, protections for free speech are about all people have the right to free speech. In the United States, the First Amendment is about Congress shall make no law. So it really does help us understand that the First Amendment is primarily concerned with restrictions on private speech by government. And in the context of campus speech, a public university like James Madison is the government, right? So the First Amendment constrains how James Madison University might regulate speech among its community members. Whereas Bridgewater College and other private universities are not the government. They are private entities. And therefore, the First Amendment doesn't actually have much to say at all about how they regulate speech on their campuses. But of course, the free speech values that undergird the First Amendment do apply to private colleges. So we can talk a little bit more about why it matters whether the First Amendment applies or whether we're just talking about First Amendment values. But the First Amendment is mostly concerned with there are two key ideas I want to introduce before we get into the details, and I think it'll help frame our discussion. One is the idea of content and viewpoint discrimination. So basically, under our constitutional jurisprudence, the government is essentially never allowed to engage in viewpoint-based discrimination. That is to say, they can never restrict speech based on the viewpoint that is expressed. You can't allow one viewpoint to be expressed, but not allow the other viewpoint to be expressed. Any kind of restriction has to be content and viewpoint neutral. So that means that, for example, speech that is offensive, speech that is hateful, or speech that conveys any kind of viewpoint that might be counter to social norms or cultural norms is in fact generally protected by the First Amendment. And we'll talk about why I actually think that that's a good thing. It's not an easy thing, but I think it's the right approach. We have robust protection for free speech, but I also want to mention that there are categories of speech that are unprotected. Not all speech is protected. Harassment is not protected. Fighting words, incitement to violence are not protected. Now, under our system, harassment, incitement, fighting words, defamation, they're all very narrow categories. In other places, they have the same categories, but they include a lot more types of speech. We have narrowly drawn those categories because of all the reasons I'm going to discuss of why we think that robust protections are important. But the primary issue I want folks to keep in mind is that the government cannot, under our system, engage in viewpoint-based discrimination, but not all speech is protected. There are categories of unprotected speech, narrow categories. So part of my job when I joined the ACLU 2 years ago was to dive into some of the thorniest issues around the First Amendment and free speech. So as I said, where free speech intersects with racial justice. This was coming directly out of Charlottesville. And so we can talk about that as well. That was before I came to the ACLU, but that was a seminal moment for sort of our most recent iteration of our work around free speech, college campuses, and racial justice. But I have to say that when I was hired to sort of dive into some of these debates, I was really frustrated with how these sorts of issues are generally discussed, especially on college campuses. Usually what happens, and I commend JMU and Bridgewater College for not necessarily taking this approach, but usually how it is done is sort of a pro and a con. Somebody who thinks free speech is a good thing, somebody who thinks free speech is a bad thing, and they debate it for an hour, and sort of we leave it there and hope that we come up with some good conclusions out of it. I think that when I see these types of debates, I'm often quite frustrated with both sides. On the one hand, I agree with the side that says that we have systemic racism that permeates our culture, our institutions. We do not live in there's no level playing field when it comes to speech, and that some speech is quite harmful and reinforces existing power dynamics, including embedded white supremacy within our whole culture. So I fully am on the team of those who believe that that is a serious problem in our country. At the same time, a lot of the people who hold that belief believe that the solution is to have more restrictions on speech. And on the other side, you have folks who are saying, you know what, no, the response to offensive speech is more speech. And I'll talk about why I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that, but I end up agreeing with one side on the problem and the other side on the solution. And so my journey to the First Amendment is, I hope, a bit more nuanced than sort of what those two archetypal camps tend to present. I root my belief in the need for free speech protections in international human rights and the fundamental right that we all possess to hold opinions, to have a voice, to disagree with our leaders, and to hold folks to account. I also have a fundamental distrust of government to make decisions about what is okay to say or not say. My journey to the First Amendment was through working in places like Uganda with LGBT activists who were locked up just for holding pride marches. Even pride events within private homes were landed people in jail. So I've seen firsthand through my colleagues all over Africa and all around the world what happens when you don't have robust protections for free speech, when the government does have the right and the authority to discriminate against people based on their viewpoints. And so that is what convinced me that it was really important for any system that people have the right to individually decide what they believe and to speak. Action, of course, is a different thing. The government can regulate action. As I said, there's unprotected speech, but there's also criminal action. Assault is not covered by free speech or the First Amendment. But I came to this work because I've seen firsthand what happens when you don't have these types of protections. I also come to this work out of admiration for activists, especially campus activists, and sort of in recognition of the great power that they hold to shape our society, to shape their campuses, to shape their communities, and to shape our society as a whole. So it's to encourage and to protect the right of activists to speak out and to criticize and to hold folks accountable for wrongdoing. That really is the root of why I believe that free speech is so important. So with that bit of sort of introduction to me and my work and the ACLU, I just want to give a couple of examples of recent relevant cases or interventions that we've had. The first was an amicus brief. It was one of my first projects that I did when I was at the ACLU. It was an amicus brief in a case at Arkansas State University. So what happened with Arkansas State was that there was a student group, conservative student group, that was trying to set up a table on campus, a very common occurrence before the pandemic, to solicit signatures so that they could start a chapter on campus. Campus police showed up and said, "You're not allowed to put a table here." They were on in a walkway, not obstructing traffic, but in a sort of public area, campus centrally located. But campus police said, "You're not allowed to table here." One of the people was a student, the other person was not a student. And the university police basically kicked them off campus and said that they weren't allowed, that they were violating the campus free speech policy. So the ACLU has long stood against these types of restrictions on free speech. And it brings up this really interesting issue of, you might have heard about how speech is protected in different ways in different spaces. And the highest protection for free speech is in public sidewalks and public parks, right? These are called traditional public fora, where since time immemorial, the Supreme Court has said, this is the place where we have robust public debate. You stand up on a soapbox, you spew your crackpot ideas or your brilliant ideas, depending on the person listening. But that's the place where we really know and understand that that's the place that we have the most robust protections for free speech. Of course, inside of a workplace, inside of a classroom, on private property, there may be much stricter restrictions on what you can say in those places. But in a traditional public forum, we really believe that the strongest protections apply. The question in this case was, is a college campus, are the walkways on a college campus a traditional public forum? And this is an interesting question because of the unique nature of college campuses. I know some of us are on campuses, some of us wish we were back on campus, but we're not able to be there safely. But it really brings up the idea that colleges are where people live, they're where people study, and they are where people work. Even students, like an RA, might be doing all those three things kind of at the same time in their dorm room, right? And so for those of us who are not students, we don't have to, live next to our coworkers or, eat with our neighbors necessarily. So I just want to highlight the fact that college campuses are quite unique in terms of the challenges they pose and the variety of roles that they play in students' lives. But we also know that college campuses are a place where new ideas are supposed to emerge and are supposed to be interrogated and are supposed to be explored. So on the one hand, we think of college as a place where we should have as many ideas as possible. It is fundamentally a place for new ideas and a place for debate and discussion. While at the same time, we have to recognize that we are subjecting college students to potentially offensive speech in a way that professional folks or adults are not. So it's much harder on students than it is on other folks to deal with these types of First Amendment protections. So I just want to highlight the idea that the unique nature of a college campus actually creates some interesting questions around what kinds of protections and what kinds of restrictions can be placed on speech on campus. So we argued in that case that the sidewalk of a public university must be considered a traditional public forum, such that you cannot create quote unquote free speech zones where one is allowed to protest. The Arkansas State policy was especially egregious. You needed 72 hours notice and prior approval in order to set up a table anywhere on campus. Protests were only allowed in certain designated areas and with pre-approval, all of which we think had an enormous chilling effect. That is to say that it discouraged protected speech in a way that didn't achieve any legitimate goal that the government might have. So As I mentioned, it was a conservative group. It was Turning Points USA, which some of you might be familiar with. A group I'll say candidly, I can't imagine an issue on which I agree with them. But we decided that it was important to intervene in this case because our affiliate, the ACLU, has affiliates in all 50 states. I think that's our great strength, is that we are a national organization with affiliates in all 50 states. And our Arkansas affiliate has for years been complaining about the university's free speech zone policy. And we've written them lots of letters, we've threatened suits before, but this lawsuit presented itself and we decided to intervene. Now, to be quite honest, this is an issue where ACLU's choice of clients came to the fore. There are a lot of reasons. We work on women's rights. We work on LGBT rights. We work on immigrants' rights. We work on women's rights. We work on disability rights. We work on all sorts of quite honestly progressive causes, reproductive freedom. And Turning Point USA is explicitly counter to a large number of those goals, or have polar opposite positions on a lot of those issues. So to be quite fair, it gave us pause, and it concerned some of our colleagues the extent to which we might be encouraging a group like Turning Points USA. And so what we did in this situation, and I think we can talk a little bit more about how a strategic litigation organization like the ACLU chooses its clients, but we did something a little bit, I'll admit, a little bit cute in this case, where we found another student organization that was also subject to this policy, that had also had trouble setting up tables and doing public actions. And this student group, wonderfully enough, was called Peace and Love. So we actually wrote an amicus brief saying that the Arkansas State free speech zone policy was unconstitutional, and we wrote it on behalf of Peace and Love rather than on behalf of this group that we had serious concerns with their ultimate goals. So I think that this just illustrates a little bit not only how complicated issues around campus life can be in terms of how we treat different campus spaces as a constitutional matter, but also how we think about strategic litigation and pushing our country in the direction that we want it to go, while also protecting these fundamental principles that we think need to be, as I mentioned, viewpoint and content neutral. So I'm happy to talk more about the Arkansas State specifics and other cases, but I think that kind of illustrates some of the ways that we tangle with some of these thorny issues. The other example I wanted to bring up is a project that I recently finished as a part of a fellowship that I did with the University of California National Center on Free Speech and Civic Engagement. It's a very long title. I think I got it right. But through that fellowship, I did a project at the University of California, San Diego, UCSD. And that project was focused on providing a training workshop on the First Amendment for student activists. So I think the focus on student activists is something that I am passionate about. As I mentioned earlier, it's student activists who inspire me, who invigorate me. My favorite part of my job is working with student activists. And so, there are all sorts of ways that you can attack campus speech. A lot of folks have tried to figure out what university administrators should do in the face of First Amendment questions. Student affairs professionals, what they need to do in the face of free speech issues. Legislatures, what should the rules and the laws be regarding campus speech? But I chose to focus my intervention on student activists, and in particular, making sure that they have all the tools and understanding necessary when inevitably a quote unquote free speech incident happens on their campus. I wanted to make sure that as they make their decisions about how to respond, when to respond, to whom they might respond, whether they're going to protest, what are going to be their demands. I want to make sure that those student activists understand fully what the First Amendment protects, what it doesn't protect, and why we think that those robust protections are important, so that they can craft their demands and craft their strategy with full understanding of what are sort of the rules and norms. Now, they may disagree with some of those rules and norms, but the fact is that we as a nation have trained a generation of young folks to be extremely empathetic, to be extremely energized around public policy issues. We've seen a huge groundswell of youth activism. And I think that we can be proud of how engaged and active young people are right now. I'm 37, so when I say young people, I mean college students and younger. But at the same time, we've seen that civic education has been really deprioritized with the emphasis on other academic subjects in K-12 education. So it shouldn't be a surprise that we end up with a lot of college students who are eager and energetic to fix the problems in our society, which are many, but also that they may not have a full and comprehensive and nuanced understanding of some of the constitutional norms at play if they have never been taught these things. So my approach was very much to sort of root the workshop in scenarios, real world scenarios that occur on colleges, campuses across the country. I'm sure JMU and BC, I know a few of the things that have happened on those campuses, but, and they're always likely to occur again. The question for me was, when student activists are trying to decide what to do next, what we often see is, okay, there's a racist incident on campus, whether it's a campus visitor who is gonna say or say something offensive, or a professor makes a joke or a comment that people find offensive, or students, whether it's a costume or a party or some kind of interaction between students where a free speech issue might arise. So often what we see is the incident happens, the university sort of says, we know that we can't discriminate based on viewpoint, so there's nothing we can do. And student activists say, why are you sitting on your hands? You need to prohibit, you need to ban, you need to punish this type of speech. And again, the university says we can't do that because of the First Amendment. And so my goal was to try to break a bit of this loop by making sure that student activists understand what's in the First Amendment. And when the administration says there's nothing we can do, understand why they're saying that, and also be able to say, okay, look, I understand the First Amendment, I understand viewpoint discrimination, but what I'm actually asking you to do is A, B, and C in terms of how we can help heal our community and improve our community without violating any constitutional norms. So we did this workshop. I think it was really illuminating and inspiring to see how these students at UCSD are able, when given the time and the space and the information, to really wrestle with these ideas. They're hard ideas. Too often, I think we act as if these are easy constitutional questions, because in some cases they are clear constitutional questions. But in all cases, these free speech issues, these offensive speech issues, really are emotionally extremely difficult. And they are community problems that we need to help resolve as a community. So that was the basic idea behind that project, but I think it conveys a bit of the approach that we have, which is the First Amendment should be seen by student activists as facilitating their work towards improving their campuses, their communities, and their country, and not as a blockage to accountability. As I often say to administrators, between punishment and expelling someone for their speech and sitting on your hands and doing nothing are all the good ideas for how we can respond as a community to things that are hurtful to people within our community. I think, both of those examples, both the Arkansas State example, which involved people walking on campus sidewalks, and the UCSD workshop, where we convened, I think it was 13 student leaders for 3 nights for a workshop, were before COVID-19, right? And so we have a different situation. College is primarily online for most folks now. And I think that it's worth thinking a little bit about what that means, right? And how that implicates the First Amendment and free speech. I think on the positive side, we've seen actually more access in many ways, where I know some of the people I've talked to have said, look, things like city council meetings, where students would have had a really hard time making it to a Tuesday 10 a.m. city council hearing. Now that those things are mostly live streamed and broadcast online, students actually can do that, as long as they're not in another class. It's much easier for them to participate in these types of public debates. In some ways, people are having more access to administrators who, it's much easier to get in touch with university presidents or deans or other administrators than it was when they may or may not have been in their office. They might be traveling, they might be somewhere else. But we're all more online, for better or for worse, we're also more accessible. But at the same time, as we've seen these sort of positive developments of being more online, obviously there have been some real challenges in terms of privacy. We've seen, Zoom bombing and people being generally unsure what types of protections are in place with these use of different platforms. What does it mean that Google is now my kid's teacher, not teacher, but my kid's classroom, basically? And also equity implications, right? So for people who don't have internet access, who don't have, or reliable internet access, people who don't have high-speed devices for remote learning, it sort of entrenches a lot of these existing inequalities in some really important ways. But I think specifically in terms of campus speech, one of the things that I'm thinking a lot about, and I'd love to hear from the Q&A, what others are experiencing in the last few months and at the beginning of the school year. But I think one example that a professor at UCSD brought up to me was, somebody said something that offended some students in a comment board on a class website, right? And the difference between a comment said in a discussion session and a comment posted on a class website might be quite interesting, right? Something that can be seen, shared, revisited later, that's posted online, screenshotted and spread around the campus, as opposed to someone's inarticulate thoughts shared in the course of a classroom discussion, are quite different, right? And in terms of the response, things that may have been resolved or at least addressed in some measure with a quiet conversation in the hallway. A skilled professor can pull someone aside after a comment that may have offended some people in the class and say, what were you trying to convey there? Why did you convey it in that way? How do you think that made others feel? Was that your intention? If so, why? In a less pressurized way, being able to sort of have a human interaction to sort of attempt at least to dig a little bit deeper into why someone might have done something and to address it and de-escalate rather than escalate. I think it's much easier when something is written online for it to be posted, and then it blows up into an issue that needs to be addressed on a different scale. So it's just one small example, but I think it highlights the value of being able to have a quiet word with someone to address some of these issues that are quite thorny and difficult. And we can talk more generally about sort of online speech and social media, both on campus and off, if you like. But I'm not doing a good job of timekeeping, but I want to close with a few lessons learned. So I like to share some do's and don'ts, and now I'll start with the don'ts. And I have to prepare my co-panelists and the audience for a bit of heresy. Now, I think I'm in the midst of the James Madison lecture. I'm talking to James Madison University. But one of my don'ts is that you'll almost never hear me talking about the wisdom of the founding fathers. That is not why I come to believe so strongly in free speech. The founding fathers were flawed individuals who lived a very long time ago. And so, not to say that they were necessarily wrong about this, but the fact that James Madison said it is not the reason that I believe it. It's not so, his views are interesting and important, but they're not so instructive to me about how we need to address some of these issues today. So, and to be honest, once we start relying on the wisdom or genius or sanctity of the founding fathers, we're going to lose a lot of your audience, right? Because the gaps in their brilliance had real implications for Black Americans, for women, for all sorts of folks who were not included in the original American dream. So my belief in free speech has nothing to do fundamentally with the founding fathers, with all due respect to those whose names adorn this very event. Another thing I never do when I talk about free speech is sort of lament the state of kids these days, which is, I think, another common problem that free speech activists have. Some sort of hearkening back to some time when people understood that the price of democracy was hearing offensive comments. And I think, as I said, I think we are in great hands with the youth in terms of their energy and their empathy And if you want to convince them of something, lamenting that they're ignorant or that they don't understand the price of democracy is a terrible way to start that argument. So you'll never hear me sort of lamenting the state of our youth. And the last thing is, with all due respect to Oliver Wendell Holmes, you will not hear me talking about the marketplace of ideas. This is an idea that, the truth will bubble to the top. And the reason that we need as much speech as possible is because that's how we get to a more just outcome. And for me, it's a pretty unconvincing line of argumentation, right? Just as I don't necessarily trust the economic marketplace to yield a just outcome, I don't trust the marketplace of ideas to inevitably yield a just or truthful outcome either. I think, especially when we're talking about online speech, where one person can reach huge audiences with things that may or may not be true, may or may not be factual, I don't think we can have a blind trust that the quote unquote marketplace of ideas will lead us to a righteous place. But that doesn't mean I don't think we should protect a variety of speech. It's just that I don't think it's because of this fabled marketplace. In the positive side, the things that I do rely on when I think about free speech and when I talk about free speech with student activists and administrators and other folks who are interested is I always come back to the fundamental right to hold your own opinion, to voice that opinion, and to dissent from the cultural and societal norms in which you live. All of us have at least some view that is in a minority, right? And so we all have a stake in making sure that you're allowed to disagree with the pervasive norms. The second thing that I always come back to, aside from everybody's fundamental right to have an opinion, is a distrust of government. And I think that this is can be a bipartisan thing. But I don't trust the government to decide what it's okay to think, to decide what's okay to think or say. This is, again, why I think viewpoint discrimination must be prohibited and should continue to be prohibited, even though that means that hateful ideas, offensive viewpoints do fall under the protection of the First Amendment. If you think that the government should do more to punish hateful speech, think about what that means in terms of who's making that decision. Right now, that's Attorney General Barr. Right? And before, it was Attorney General Jeff Sessions, who has said that the Black Lives Matter movement is a hate group, right? And if that doesn't scare you, then think about Attorney General Elizabeth Warren and what she would think is a hate group, right? So I think that we have to remember that dissent will always be punished if you give the government the authority to decide what is okay to say and what is not okay to say. Anyone who wants to change anything in our society should want to protect all of us from a government that discriminates based on viewpoint. Finally, and I think this is really fundamental, is we have to remember that people have the capacity to change. And I don't want to sound naive here. I mean, we live in a very polarized society. It's hard to imagine anyone sort of switching sides in 2020. But even in a polarized society, we all have to remember that each of us has changed our minds about something important over the course of our lives. And even if you're not willing to admit that now, somebody you know, or maybe everybody you know, has changed their minds about something important over the course of their lives. And so if we have a restorative justice approach, my kids may or may not run in here at some point, but when they do something that I don't like, I have an option of punishing them, sending them to their room, or I have an option of engaging in a sort of restorative justice approach where they understand they're held accountable for their actions. They have to confront whoever it is they hurt. Most often it's the little brother who hurt the bigger brother. But we have to be able to have enough creativity and nuance to address harm, both by holding the harm maker accountable and by helping to heal the person who has been harmed without resorting to prohibiting, banning, outlawing the speech or ideas that have been conveyed. So just as I want to, fight mass incarceration with a more restorative justice approach, because I think that I think punishment does not particularly work, especially incarceration doesn't particularly work. I also have to remember that people who have offensive ideas, punishing them, prohibiting them, outlawing those ideas is not the way that we're ultimately going to have a more free and just society. So I will stop there, but I'm happy to answer any other questions you have about the ACLU, my own work, or any specific campus speech issues that have arisen. But I look forward to the discussion with the Presidents Alger and Bushman. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Emerson. I believe that President Bushman and Alger have now joined you for the next part of the conversation.
Thank you, Roy. Thank you, Emerson, for those comments. That was great. I appreciate it. I was thinking about the questions I might want to ask and the things I hoped you might say, and you've already, frankly, answered all my questions. So I'm hoping I can get you to expand a little bit on some of the things that you've talked about. And I won't speak for John Alger in this case, although I know he shares a lot of my views on how we approach issues of protected expression on a college campus. There are certainly differences. You've already talked about the differences between public and private universities in what our legal obligations are around freedom of speech. But I think for both of us, there's a much higher obligation, and that's tied directly to our mission and who we are, the reason we're here in the first place. Can you talk a little bit more, particularly for, say, for our students at a private place, a private college or university, why a robust protection of expression is so important to the core mission of what it is that we do?
Sure. No, I appreciate that question, President Bushman. I mean, I think, you know, as we said, the primary concern of the First Amendment is governments. What really terrifies me, and what I said as I saw firsthand, is when a government can put you in jail for the viewpoint that you have. So I do think that it's important to maintain that focus on government action. But the other justifications for free speech in terms of individuals' right to hold and express views, I think, are just as relevant on a private campus. And as I say to administrators at public and private universities, when these difficult questions around how do we protect speech, even speech that we don't like, come up, the first response, even at a public university, should not be to think about, oh, what are the First Amendment obligations, right? I think we have to think about colleges and universities as communities, right? And the first reaction has to be to look at the person across from you, who's a fellow member of your community, and listen to what they have to say, listen to their concerns. Usually they're going to be more complicated and nuanced than you realized. A lot of times what happens when these free speech incidents happen is it's really not just the one incident, right? People feel uncomfortable, people feel disrespected, people feel oppressed for a whole host of different issues. And it might be bubbling up at this particular moment. So I think the first thing we need to do is be community members and be willing to listen and think about how we can support and address these issues. And as I often say, like the First Amendment should be second or third on your list of things. First and foremost, look at the person across from you, have some empathy, and listen. And I think that's just as true for a public university as it is for a private university. And I don't mean to say that the vast majority of student affairs professionals don't do this, but I know that because the constitutional questions can be so hard, and especially at a private university where there aren't the constitutional questions directly, the sort of impulse might be just to sort of pull away or pull back. And I think if we think of it not just as a constitutional issue, but as a community issue, I think we're on a much better footing. And I think that way people can be heard, right? And if someone feels heard and if they feel like you're being empathetic and you're genuinely trying to help, you're less likely to run into the same types of problems in the future. I don't mean to be, again, naive that, you know, one heartfelt conversation can change everything. But I think there is a big difference. And what you see time and time again, these issues come up all the time, but the times when they blow up and the times they end up in the paper and the times that they end up with massive demonstrations and shutdowns and everything is when the university's first response is seen to be tone deaf or dismissive, right? And if the first person that hears about it listens, genuinely takes it seriously, and as I argue, doesn't necessarily resort just to the idea of punishment or do nothing, I think we're in a much better place. And that, as I said, that applies to private as well as public universities.
Thank you, Emerson. I wanted to jump in a slightly different direction because, again, you anticipated a lot of the questions I was going to ask as well. And I really appreciate you making these issues very accessible to the audience because these are difficult constitutional issues, and there is nuance. One of the exceptions that we haven't talked about yet that I'm wondering if you could say a little bit more about is content neutral time, place, and manner regulations. You hear about, someone shouting, on the quad at 2:00 in the morning, and it doesn't matter necessarily what they're, shouting, but it can literally wake people up when they're trying to sleep, for example, right? Can you say a little bit more about that and how that comes into play on a college campus?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, and again, it sort of gets a little bit back into the question of whether we're talking about a traditional public forum or a place where the government has more authority to restrict speech. I mean, you were talking about on the college quad, which I think we could all agree is the closest to a public square where we're most likely to be able to say that that's a traditional public forum. But as you said, even in a traditional public forum, there can be time, place, and manner restrictions as long as they're content and viewpoint neutral. As you mentioned, you can restrict people from, disturbing the peace is a tough one, right? Because it's often used as a weapon against dissent. But as you said, you can restrict people's loud music late at night. But these things are where we also end up pushing back a lot because time, place, and manner restrictions are often cover for viewpoint-based discrimination. So the line between what is time, place, and manner and what is content-based or viewpoint-based can be quite difficult to discern, and it's highly fact-specific. Literally, what time of day was it? How close were you to residences? All those types of things become really, really important. But as you said, as long as the rules are content and viewpoint neutral, you can restrict the time, the place, and the manner. But I think one other sort of related question is around sort of permits. And the permits permits can be required when you're having a protest that's going to shut down roads or restrict access or restrict public walkways or take over a building or use sound amplification. And universities or other government officials can say, you can't use the amplification after this time of day, or you can't block off this road at this time, but we're going to let you block off that road at that time, or someone else has already booked this park. So you need to choose a different day, as long as it's not because of what they're saying. It's not the side of the issue that they're taking, and it's not about the message that they have to convey. The one caveat to that, though, is that you cannot prohibit a protest just because it doesn't have a permit, right? The Constitution does protect spontaneous protests. So just because you don't have prior approval, just because you haven't obtained a permit, even if it's a lawful permit requirement, that's not in and of itself enough reason to prohibit a protest. I mean, you are, a former general counsel at one of the biggest universities in the country. So I'm also interested to hear how you've figured out how to navigate those things. I know that the University of Michigan has been put through the ringer on more than one occasion, trying to figure out exactly what types of restrictions are lawful in terms of responding to calls from students to protect them from offensive speech, while also trying to uphold constitutional obligations. But as you mentioned, there are certain types of restrictions that a government can put on speech, but it can never be on the basis of content or viewpoint.
And I think your answer reminds us, one of the questions I would always ask when I used to wear my lawyer hat was, let's turn the tables for a moment and assume that whoever it is that is speaking or violating this rule that you want to apply has a very different viewpoint. Would you still apply the rule in the same way? Because if it sort of ferrets out, whether this really is viewpoint neutral or not sometimes, right? When people start to talk about, well, why is it in this case that you want to apply a rule? So that idea of consistency of application, I think schools get into trouble when, they have rules perhaps that they say they have, but then they don't apply them 99% of the time. Then all of a sudden, there's something that is offensive to a particular part of your constituency. And that's when you decide to apply the rule. I think that's where it can get really tricky for not just colleges, but all sorts of public entities. Go ahead. No,
just briefly, I was just going to say, relatedly, the idea of the the sort of level at which, what kind of discomfort you're going to allow for the audience and what level of inconvenience you're going to allow as well. As you mentioned, it might be okay to ban loudspeakers at 2 a.m. But at the same time, say, some minor inconvenience to passersby or annoyance to passersby is far outweighed by our commitment to free speech. So we do have to say that the point of protest, the point of free speech, is to cause some discomfort, right? And so just because it makes some folks uncomfortable on one side or the other doesn't mean that it falls into the sort of permissible area of regulation, and that we do have to maintain some space that, protest is going to be a pain, especially for folks like you and and President Bushman.
Thank you. David, I'm wondering if we should turn it over to Roy here, because I see that there are some good questions coming in. I want to make sure we can engage the audience.
Yeah, no, I agree, John. I was going to say, I'm looking at the chat there. There are quite a few good questions coming in. I think that'd be great. Roy, you want to start?
Sure. I'll start by saying that the print is so little, but I'll give it a shot here, Emerson and David and John. So first question from Chris. He asks, why not just allow students and citizens to speak freely? As long as they aren't making direct threats at specific people, then let it go. The tighter you restrict speech, the more people speak with violence. Let them vent. Let people tell you where they stand and why. So I guess that's a little bit of a question, a little bit of a statement. Any response?
Well, I mean, I agree that we should let people generally speak. The question of why don't we? It's because people say things that are very offensive and mean and harmful, and people understandably respond to that and don't appreciate it. So I think that as much as I believe strongly in the robust protections for free speech, I'm not dismissive of why people have counter views. I think there are really good reasons that people are suspicious of free speech. I think that ultimately it's misguided to respond to offensive speech by giving the government more power. But I do think that we have to acknowledge that the status quo of free and open debate, as I said, it's not a level playing field. We have all these other institutional inequalities, social inequalities that play into it. Who feels empowered to use their free speech? So it's not the case that some kind of hands-off approach is ultimately the most fair, because I think that people who are marginalized are always gonna get the short end of the stick. I just think that the solution is not to increase the government's authority to restrict it. It's not because I think that anybody who has a problem with free speech is either too sensitive or ignorant.
Hey, Roy, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. While you were asking that question, I was reading along with you on the question there. There was one a little bit further down, and I don't know how much, I don't know the time constraints on tonight, but this is one that turns out to be, I think, really applicable for all of us right now. And the question deals with something for the moment on our campus around a mask. And I got the question, Emerson, the other day, would we permit a mask to have hateful symbology on it? And there's a question that somebody's asked, how is free speech applicable to nonverbal symbols displayed across campuses, public and private? So what about nonverbal? What about somebody with a mask, right, that's got, or a flag in a residence hall window? Can you talk about that a little bit, how that connects to protected expression?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's a bit of a complicated question around sort of what is speech, and in our system, a lot more is considered speech than might be considered in other sorts of systems. Even political contributions are considered speech, and these nonverbal symbols often usually are considered speech. As I said, action, assault, those types, like physically confronting someone is not considered speech. But outward displays of one's ideas are considered speech. And so how they might be addressed on a college campus, again, I think at Bridgewater recently, there was a situation where someone had a swastika on their Zoom background. And I think, I think that's terrible, right? I think it's a really sad thing that someone would think that was a good idea to put that on their Zoom background. And I think that Bridgewater has an obligation to address that issue with that student, with the other students who saw it, with the campus at large. What I don't think you need to do is to ban backgrounds that anyone might find offensive. I think once you get into that territory, it becomes really, really hard to draw the line. If someone has a Black Lives Matter poster behind them, someone else might say, I'm offended by that. And then you have to say, well, whose offense is more important than who else's? So again, I think that is a situation that is tragic. I think it's a really unfortunate thing for the community and something that needs to be addressed comprehensively and quickly. But I also think that without resorting to some sort of prohibition or ban. But it is interesting to think about like what kinds of things are speech. I mean, there was a recent case, just to see how far this goes. Sorry for bringing us off of campus speech specifically, but you were talking about time, place, and manner and content-based restrictions. There's a rule I forget which city it is now, maybe President Aldra, you followed this case, but basically there was a rule that said that billboards, again, non-verbal symbol, a billboard can that is on a building can only advertise what's in that building, right? So you can't have a billboard attached to a building advertising something else. And that seems on its face like a location-based restriction. It's not based on viewpoint. It's not saying you can't have an ad about abortion or whatever. It's just saying that if you have a sign on a billboard on a building, it has to only be related to that business. But the court has said that is a content-based restriction, and it doesn't relate to any compelling government interest, right? Because it says that you can only talk about this certain thing in this certain place without any good justification, right? So even things that on their face might look like neutral time, place, and manner restrictions can actually be considered content-based regulation. So yes, nonverbal symbols definitely are protected, and it goes much further than you might initially think.
Emerson, there's another question here that touches on part of what you were discussing. But before I ask it, I think I just want to say what I'm learning most in this interaction is not only that we need to allow free speech and we need to listen, but we need to ask more questions to get at perhaps what the real issues are behind what these restrictions tell us about institutional inequity. So this question comes from Andreas. And he asks, how do you deal with the following paradox of completely protected speech? The wealthy can spend their resources to drown out viewpoints they disagree with or just don't care for. Without interventions and restrictions, it is private actors who edge out the freedom to speak of many.
I think it's, yeah, do you want to say more or just leave?
No, that was it, yeah.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I think it gets at a couple of issues. One is I think it's a reference to Citizens United, which is by far internally and externally, I think the ACLU's least popular free speech position. And to be quite honest, I will not stand here and defend it. But I think it also gets to the issue of, what do we do about private actors? And I think it gets back to my point also about the fact that free speech does not inevitably lead to equity. I have no delusion that free speech leads to truth, justice, or equality. I just think that it's the best way that we have to protect dissenting voices, and it's rooted in my distrust of government to make these types of decisions. But it doesn't address income inequality. It doesn't address the disproportionate wealth of some individuals. And I think it also gets to the question, I mean, it's not explicitly in here, but sort of social media platforms, which are also private entities that wield a great deal of power over who gets to speak and who doesn't get to speak. Both explicitly through content moderation, but also through algorithms that are very opaque, that we don't really know how certain things pop up in our feed and others don't. So, I mean, my short answer is I totally agree with you that the First Amendment does not solve those problems. I happen to think that that's not a reason to abandon the First Amendment, but it is to recognize its limitations and the fact that there are a whole bunch of other things we need to do in our society rather than beyond just protecting free speech. That's not going to get us there.
Thank
Roy,
you.
can I ask a quick follow-up on that? Just, you mentioned social media, Emerson, and that's one of the interesting challenges, right? That has grown exponentially, certainly in my time in higher education. We talk all the time with students about information literacy and not just believing things because you see it on Twitter or Facebook or what have you. But what practical advice do you have for institutions when you have these, something that might be offensive that's on Twitter or Facebook, and maybe it was posted by one of your own community members? How do you deal with those things? Any practical advice for whether it's the administrators or other faculty, staff, and students?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. I think this is really on the edge of where our thinking is now, because as you said, the place of social media in our lives is constantly evolving. The mechanisms themselves are constantly evolving. And I think when we start talking about social media platforms, it's also important. As I said, my team is the Speech, Privacy, and Technology Project. I deal primarily with First Amendment free speech, offline as well as online, but we have other folks who are really dealing with the technological side of things, who really understand how the internet works and how these different platforms work. And it is relevant to these conversations to really think about what we are asking universities to do, or might ask universities to do, whether that's technologically possible, and what are the implications, intended or unintended, of creating the mechanisms by which a university might even respond to these types of things, in terms of, even if we were to say that there can be some regulation of online speech, how technically might that even happen without incredible intrusions into privacy? So one question is around what's on campus and what's off campus when we're talking about online speech, and what's within the purview of the university and what's not. And I think this is even more of an issue in K-12 education, right? Because universities generally have less power to regulate the speech of their students than a K-12 school does. The courts acknowledge that you can't have massive protests in a fourth grade classroom. Like, they have a legitimate interest in having quiet in the hallways and that kind of thing. Whereas at a college and university, you're going to be able to deal with a little bit more disruption. They're adults, they can handle it. So part of it is a matter of, where does the university's authority to respond end when we're talking about speech that may or may not be on campus? And even thinking about, I don't think it exists anymore, but there was an application, it's sort of gone out of fashion, but it was really about geographic location. So you could post and it could be seen by people who are like within a mile or two of you, right? So this is really popular on campuses. So is it different to post something on Twitter where the whole world can see it versus posting something where only people on your campus can see it? Does that have a different free speech implication? Does the First Amendment have different things to say about that type of expression in terms of whether the government is, or the university is implicated or not? So again, it's super fact specific in terms of how you can regulate this online speech, but also this sort of general principle of the platforms themselves and the details of the platforms themselves matter, and they're private entities themselves that have their own First Amendment rights. Like, Twitter gets to decide what's on its platform. It's not the government. So Twitter can do all kinds of content moderation. We think that they shouldn't do much moderation because they're really bad at it. But they have the right to moderate the content as much as they want to. Of course, James Madison University doesn't have the right to moderate content as much as they want to, but how they interact with these private entities is a really complicated thing, and definitely depends a lot on not just who was posting and when and what was said and where, but also what the mechanisms of the particular platform are. And while we can think about social media and online life as one sort of big bundle of things, people who actually understand these things realize that it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, one of the relevant ideas, it's a little bit different, but in terms of whether or not there should be back doors into people's phones and that kind of thing. Like, if we say, for example, that James Madison has an obligation to prohibit offensive speech on social media by its students, by what mechanism are we then going to give? Are we going to give James Madison some backdoor key to get into these social media platforms in order to regulate the speech. I think we don't really want to do that, right? So we have to be careful about sort of a simplistic understanding of, we don't like what you just said, how can we stop it?
Emerson, can you speak for a moment about, because we're talking about campus speech, but I think what's interesting is to think of it differently in terms of student as opposed to employee. And so there's so much now in social media that gets amplified depending on sort of who you're speaking for. If you're speaking for yourself, if you're speaking for the university or college you work for, or if you're speaking as a student, a part of the student body in those places. And I wonder if you could speak a little bit about the nuances and differences of what sort of is allowed or how it's defined.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, I had a small group meeting with some students from both Bridgewater and James Madison earlier today. And at least one of them was an RA, a resident assistant. And I think RAs really sort of highlight exactly what you're talking about, because they are at the same time students, residents, and employees. So, at different times, even within the same conversation, they might be a government official who's bound by the First Amendment to not discriminate based on viewpoint, while also being a student activist, while also being a community member. So I think that these can be really complicated questions about sort of students who have, especially students who have these dual roles. What is it? When do they have which hat on? And it's, again, if somebody is an RA and they want to put up some kind of political message, is it okay for them to put it on the front of their door in their residence hall? Is that a government endorsement of a particular viewpoint? What if it's inside their room? What if they put it in the bulletin board in the common area? Are other students allowed to use the bulletin board in the common area differently from the RAs? I think all of these can be really fact-specific, kind of complicated questions. A lot of it has to do with sort of what were the rules that were established at the outset, and what were the expectations, and whether those were constitutional of themselves, and whether they were lived up to. But the line between being a student and being an employee, especially at a public university, can be among the most difficult. More generally, employee speech, this is something that we get questions about a lot in terms of can I be punished for participating in a march? Can I be fired for having, posted something on social media in favor or against a particular political movement? And the truth is, for private employers, they usually have quite a bit of leeway to take employment actions based on someone's speech, even on their off time. It depends on someone's contract. It depends on the terms of employment. But private employers are not bound by the First Amendment. Public employers are bound by the First Amendment, but then you have to get into the question of, was the speech by the employee, whether it was on, during their time or not during their time on the clock, but also was it related to their particular role or not, right? So if you are someone who works for the Department of Homeland Security and you're posting on your home time something about the intelligence community, they might lawfully regulate that, right? But they can't tell you that you're not allowed to share your religious views on your own time or that kind of thing. So, and on social media, bringing it back to, I think, the initial part of your question, there have been all sorts of cases which people have probably seen around public accounts versus personal accounts. So if you're a senator, you might have you should have two accounts. You should have your official Senate account and then your personal account. Now, whether that's sort of a legal fiction or not is another question. But if you have an official account, now that's a government space, and that might be some courts would not. I don't think any courts have said that that's a traditional public forum, but at least they've said that it's a limited public forum where the government has opened up some space for people to share their views, and they cannot engage in viewpoint-based discrimination. They may engage in some content-based discrimination if it's you might have some rule that it has to be on topic at a town hall. You can say you have to sit down because you're not talking about the topic that we're talking about. That's a legitimate regulation of private speech, even within a public forum. But you can't say you have to sit down because you disagree with me. Nor can you block somebody, as we've learned from the courts very recently. Public officials cannot block people from their public accounts based on their viewpoints. So, but you might be able to do that on your private account. So this question of which hat you're wearing, either on social media or in the case of an RA, and which part of their own dormitory, is really an interesting question, and also depends a lot on the facts. And again, even for social media, Twitter accounts might be treated differently than accounts on other social media platforms that might have different mechanisms and norms. So it's a great question, but it's definitely an emerging area of law where we're really trying to figure out what kinds of lines the court is going to be willing to draw there.
So, thank you. So Emerson, I think one of the interesting moments here is that your discussion has made some of these topics that are difficult to understand, like the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and our rights as individuals and as groups. But you've given some real tangible examples, both that you've had and others. So this comes from a student at JMU, and I think it's got some real practical questions in here that we would benefit from hearing the answers. So JMU student, she's participating in a student-run PR firm on campus. They're campaigning One for All, centered around the connection between the First Amendment and Black Lives Matter movement. She has two questions. First one is, what are some tips for ways we can virtually engage the student body regarding this topic? And the second, what are key points you think are important to get across regarding the intersection between the First Amendment and Black Lives Matter / racial injustice?
Well, I can't tell you how much my heart skipped a beat when I started reading this question. And I really encourage Aaliyah, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing your name correctly, please reach out, send me an email, let's work together. I love what you're doing. I'd be very happy to help answer any of your questions now and in the future. I think it's great. What are some tips for ways we can virtually engage the student body? I mean, I think what we've seen, as I mentioned very briefly with online college, is that in some ways it's actually much easier to organize. I think it's easy, it's cheaper and easier to get your message out. And it might be easier to get some people to a Zoom room than it is to find time for everyone to make their way all the way across campus or something like that with class schedules. So in some ways, it might be easier to organize folks and find like-minded people now that things are mostly online. But I will say that that's easier for established organizations that are well known. I know that it's actually been really hard for new organizations to recruit new members without being able to pull people as they walk by or have funny signs or loud music, you know, in the middle of campus to try to attract some attention. So I think for there are a variety of ways, I'm sure that this person knows better than I do how to attract attention online. As I said, I'm 37, so that means that I don't know how to use the internet. But I think that, you know, it can be a challenge to attract new folks. In this situation, it's harder, but there may be ways that you can attract a wider audience than you might otherwise. And I think you can be ambitious, right? Like people who might normally not be accessible, if they don't have to travel to come to your campus to speak with you, they might be a lot more willing to engage, you know, in all sorts of ways. So I don't have any very specific practical tips. I think it depends on the campus. It depends on your goals. It depends on the audience you're trying to reach. But I do think that there are all sorts of creative ways that you can engage students online. I mean, I think part of it is a matter of like, at your particular university, how many folks are still on campus? How many folks are doing online learning? How strong are your connections to existing networks on campus? So please reach out to me directly. You can get my email address online, I think. But I'd be happy to offer more specific advice. But I think key points to get across about the intersection between the First Amendment and Black Lives Matter, I think the main thing is I think we need to proudly reclaim free speech. And as I said, not blindly to say that the free speech will lead to racial justice, but I think free speech does facilitate the kind of activism that we need in order to change our society. And we've seen over and over again, it's been students using their right to protest, using their right to dissent, using their voice that have changed our cultural norms, that have changed our society more broadly. So I say more power to you. I think that it's not that they are always mutually reinforcing necessarily. There are some times that these issues do clash, but the First Amendment is every activist friends, no matter what your particular agenda might be.
Emerson, could I ask a quick follow-up on that? One of the things that we've heard, and of course we're now in an election season, right, where there are a lot of the polarization is something that we all feel in our society. Within the last few years, we've been looking at voting patterns and why students may or may not vote or even engage in political dialogue. And one of the things that we heard from faculty and students was a reluctance to want to get engaged in topics that might be controversial, for example, in a classroom setting, out of fear of offending, other classmates, or just not wanting to go there. It's like Thanksgiving dinner, right? You don't talk about politics or religion with your relatives. And obviously, as colleges and universities, we want there to be that kind of exchange. We want there to be different points of view because that's how students learn. But any tips or thoughts about how to deal with that reluctance that people feel because they are concerned about that sense of community that you talked about?
Well, I mean, this may surprise you coming from a free speech advocate, but I think self-censorship sometimes gets too much of a bad rap. I think self-censorship in sometimes is a really good idea. I think taking a break and figuring out, how is this going to be received by the people around me? What is going to be the effect, whether intentional or unintentional, of your words? Words are powerful. And I think that, not every single idea that comes into your head does need to be shared with your class. So on that level, again, coming back to the First Amendment being a constraint on government, I am vehemently opposed to government censorship. Self-censorship, we need a little bit more of that sometimes. And I think, we want to protect robust debate, but the idea that, maybe not everything that you say in class will be welcomed by your classmate, I think that that's a part of, there are more different kinds of folks in college classrooms now, right? And so that's partly people might feel a little bit more hesitant to share certain views, but I think that that's in part, at least, because we have a broader variety of people in most classrooms now. And that's a benefit of this type of diversity. That's part of the reason that we want to have a variety of people around, is that, that pause that you might have, it's good to try out new ideas. It's good to have a voice. It's good to play with ideas in academic settings. But that pause that one might have is also a learning moment. And that hesitation that one might have might also be a learning moment. And some sense that, your words are powerful and that they might be received in a certain way is not the worst thing, in my opinion. I mean, I think that people should not feel, oppressed or silenced by their teachers or by the professors, but peer pressure and social rebuke for unpopular views is also a part of free speech. Like, your classmates' right to say that is ridiculous, and I just couldn't disagree more. That's also free speech.
It's interesting that I think personally I often learn the most from somebody else exercising their free speech, because I think to myself, that would have never occurred to me. And so it works well in both ways. So I have one here in terms of government, and I think it's a pretty interesting question. When you say that the government shouldn't be trusted to determine what should be thought/said, do you mean specifically the executive or legislative or judicial, or all three?
I'm talking about all three. I mean, they all have a different role to play they're all different branches of government, obviously. But I think we worry just as much about, we definitely worry about law enforcement or other executive branch viewpoint discrimination, whether it's use of excessive force against certain protesters, dispersing certain kinds of protests while allowing others to carry on. We have a case right now in North Carolina around a Confederate monument where we've seen that the pro-Confederate side has been treated much differently than the anti-racist side. That's law enforcement. That's the executive branch. We're super worried about that. But also when legislatures try to pass laws that restrict speech, that usually they use some kind of clever language to try to make it seem content neutral, but with a pretty clear focus. We've seen all kinds of bills proposed to try to crack down on the Black Lives Matter protests and protect police officers, give them the right to sue protesters, that kind of thing. We've also seen, I've done a bit of work on with a lot of our Native American colleagues and constituents around environmental activism and protests against pipelines and other sort of infrastructure projects. And we've seen a huge trend across the country of legislative efforts to try to punish people who are protesting against infrastructure projects. Some of these are more blatantly unconstitutional than others, but we definitely worry quite a bit about legislative actions that quell certain kinds of speech or that target certain kinds of speech. And likewise, judges. I mean, it's up to them to uphold these constitutional norms, but judges, I don't mean to break news here, but judges often get it wrong. And that's why we have courts of appeals, and they often get it wrong too. And that's why we have the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, they often get it wrong too. And that's why the ACLU sometimes loses. But the courts are not a great or perfect place to get justice, but we think they're important, and so we use them. But yeah, we're worried about all three branches, definitely. When we talk about government, the specifics of the concerns vary, but certainly all three branches should worry us if they engage in that type of discrimination based on viewpoint, and in many places content as well.
Thank you. This next question comes from Tyler. It says, free speech can derive from an array of sources. However, how can we be more civically engaged when talking about free speech in such a polarized age?
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I think, I encourage civic engagement. Part of the reason I believe in free speech is because I think that we all should feel empowered to have our own views and to express them and to share them and hopefully gather momentum behind them. I mean, I said I don't talk about the founding fathers, but Bert Newborn has a beautiful story he tells about the genius of the way that the First Amendment is crafted. And he talks about how it starts with freedom of religion, right? Which is your beliefs and your ideas. It says Congress can make no law with respect to the establishment of religion or the free exercise thereof, meaning your right to participate with other people, or the freedom of speech. So that goes from your idea to your words, or of the press, which is your words both spoken and written, presumably to a wider audience, or to peaceably assemble, meaning to gather physically together to gain momentum, and to seek redress for grievances from government, right? So the whole point is about the process of going from an idea in one's head to a social movement that actually brings about change within the society. So I think even in a polarized world, we think that the First Amendment and free speech really are the foundation for civic engagement, because it's about protecting the pathway from an idea to a movement, and from an individual to a policy or society-wide change. So I think that the free speech and civic engagement, I think, are inextricably linked in that way.
Thank you. Thank you. One last question here, which is, let me just check our time here, which is great. We have about 5 minutes left. So I guess I'd like to pose this last question, Emerson, and then I'll let you and John and David just have a minute to kind of wrap before I close out. So this is it appropriate for employees to use email taglines to promote political or to promote politics or political views?
This is the most lawyerly answer you can imagine, but it depends. It depends on the employee. It depends on who's the employer. It depends on what the political message is, who the recipient is. I think, again, with employee speech, it's actually really complicated, and it does really depend on whether it's a private employer or a public employer. You can imagine why you might not necessarily want some sort of political message coming from the chief of police, right? As at the bottom of his email tagline saying that he supports one side or another of a particular political debate. I think that would be hugely unacceptable for a public official who has the authority to make decisions, life or death decisions about political movements, to endorse one or the other in their email tagline. Now, if you are someone who works for a racial justice organization and you have a tagline in your email address or in your email signature that supports like defund the police, I don't really have a problem with that. So I think maybe the assumption is that the question is about a public employee, and I think it's probably best to avoid it if you're a public employee, just because it's probably unnecessary risk. You can express yourself in other ways, but the definite answer is that it depends.
And if we change political to religious, does that change your answer?
Not particularly.
I didn't think so. Good man. John and David or Emerson, any closing remarks from the three of you?
John, I'll start. First of all, Emerson, thank you. Thank everybody who participated tonight. I was thrilled to see all the questions, and I'm glad we had this opportunity. I think it's so important for our students to understand that this is hard, and the way you've articulated First Amendment protected expression is not a panacea. It doesn't guarantee all good things all the time, but it might be the best way we have to get there. So I appreciate your comments, and I thank you. Thank you for being a part of this.
Thank you.
And I just want to add my great thanks as well, Emerson. This has been such a wonderful opportunity. This is what we hope will happen at colleges and universities, right? Even in a virtual environment, to be able to have this kind of conversation. And what I hope comes out of this is that people have learned something, right? You've shared both the legal framework, but also very practical advice about how you deal with these issues. And I must say that to me is really important. As an educator, it's one thing to understand the legal ideas, but it's another thing to think about then what do you do with this in practice. And I have to say, as an aside, I'm so glad to hear "it depends" again, because it was one of the first things I learned in law school. When all else fails, right? That was the right answer. But thank you for being a passionate voice on this topic and for being willing to share your time and your expertise with our students. It's really been a delight.
Thank you very much. No, and I appreciate the opportunity. And I would just say for all of this, especially for the students listening, but for everybody, I encourage you to reach out. The campus work is some of my favorite parts of my job, and I would love to be helpful to anyone who has more specific questions. And I think we have a guest appearance from one of my kids who it's almost bedtime, so they're getting a little antsy. You want to say hi, Otis? Thank you all very much, and I appreciate it. I hope that this is the first of many engagements.
Well, thank you, and a big special thanks to you, Emerson, to you, John, and to David for inviting me to participate as a member of this learning community. I would just do a shameless plug that each of our institutions have robust online content, both on in-person, hybrid, and online. So please access our websites and our email blast to tune into this next opportunity. And Emerson, thank you. You've been able to engage in a conversation with us that I think could have been dry, and it instead was really interesting. And you've given me a lot to reflect about in terms of my work and our institution. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Thanks, everyone, for joining us.